Out here, deep in a West Virginia holler, where the road turns to gravel and the fog clings to the hillsides, the modern world gets quiet. You can find places like this all over the mountains. A forgotten family cemetery, nearly swallowed by ivy and time. These aren't grand monuments. They're simple weathered stones, leaning like old men tired of telling the same story. But it's the names and the dates etched upon them that pull you in. Earl Gibson died 1921. Silas Blackwood died 1923. These men didn't die in the mines. They didn't fall to the fever that swept through these camps so often. They shared one thing and one thing only. A wife. A woman named Zeo Zoe Wilkins. To the law that condemned her, she was a monster. To her few defenders, she was just the unluckiest woman in the state. But to everyone else, she had a different name, the Black Widow of Appalachia. Today, we stand among these silent stones to listen to their whispers and piece together a story this land has tried its best to forget. Let's wind the clock back 100 years. The air here wasn't clean and silent then. It was thick with the grit of coal dust, a fine black powder that settled on windowsills, in your lungs, and in the lines of every face. This hollow was alive with the rumble of coal cars on the tracks and the distant rhythmic clang of pickaxes against the mountain's bones. Life was dictated by the shriek of the company whistle, a sound that sent men like Earl Gibson into the dark belly of the earth before sunrise, and a sound that wives like Zeo Zoe prayed to hear again at the end of the day. Earl was a young man, strong and full of the quiet hope that marks so many who work a dangerous trade. He believed his back was broad enough to carve out a decent life for him and his new wife. He'd come home each evening, his face caked in black, and wash up in a basin on the porch of their small two-room cabin. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a tiny speck of warmth against the vast, indifferent mountains. Zeo Zoe was different from the other miners' wives. While they gathered on their porches to trade gossip and remedies, she often kept to herself. She wasn't unfriendly, just reserved. She had a sharp mind and a gaze that seemed to take in everything, a calm that felt out of place in a world built on noise and struggle. Some saw it as dignity. Others, even then, whispered it was a kind of coldness, an ambition that didn't belong in a simple coal camp. Their life together was a routine of small things, a shared meal of beans and cornbread by the fire, Earl talking about his dream of one day saving enough to buy a small piece of land away from the company store and its endless cycle of debt. Zeo Zoe would listen, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, her thoughts her own. To anyone looking in, they were just another young couple trying to survive in a place that didn't make survival easy. But in these mountains, death was a constant neighbor. It came suddenly in the form of a rockfall or a gas explosion in the mine. It came slowly in the wheezing cough of black lung. And it came violently in the gut-wrenching sickness they called the flux, a plague that could sweep through a camp and fill a graveyard in a matter of weeks. A doctor was a luxury, and a sudden death was a tragedy, but it was a familiar one. It was a world that had grown used to the sight of fresh-dug graves, a fact that would soon prove very convenient for someone. The stories buried in the ground are one thing. The stories buried in paper and ink are another. In a county courthouse basement, tucked away in a dusty archive box, you can find the documents that give a voice to those silent gravestones. It's amazing what survives. This here is a copy of a page from the local paper, dated 1921. It's brittle and yellow, the words printed in the stark, formal language of the time. It's a short column nestled between an advertisement for livestock feed and a notice about a church social. It's the obituary for Earl Gibson. It's barely a paragraph long, and it reads just like 100 others from that era. It says he was a fine, hard-working man, taken too soon by a sudden and severe gastric illness, a stomach flux. The kind of thing that could kill a man in 3 days and have the neighbors nodding in sympathy, murmuring about bad water or tainted food. On the surface, it's just another sad, common story. A young wife left all alone. The community pitied her. But it's another piece of paper from that same box that changes the tone completely. This one is a life insurance claim, filed by Zeo Zoe Gibson just days after her husband was in the ground. It wasn't a huge amount of money, not by today's standards. But in 1921, to a miner's widow with no other prospects, it was a small fortune. It was enough to buy a little plot of land, enough to be free from the company store, enough to breathe for the first time in her life without the weight of debt and dependency. This document right here, this isn't just an insurance policy, it's the first clue. It raises the question that no one dared to ask out loud back then. Was this just a fortunate coincidence in the midst of tragedy? Or was this the moment Zeo Zoe Wilkins realized that a husband's life had a value, but his death had a price? That insurance money from Earl's death changed things, not in a loud way, but in a way the whole holler could feel. Zeo Zoe didn't pack up and leave. She didn't waste the money on frivolous things. She bought a small plot of land, a little house just outside the direct control of the mining company. For the first time, she was a woman who owned something, a woman who answered to no one. And you have to understand, in a place where the company owned the houses, the store, and a man's very soul until his debt was paid, that kind of independence was as strange and unsettling as a summer snow. At first, the whispers were sympathetic. Good for her, some would say, making the best of a bad situation. But pity in a small town has a short shelf life, especially when the object of that pity seems to be doing just fine. Zeo Zoe's grief didn't look like the grief they were used to. It wasn't loud and public. It was a quiet, private thing. She held her head high. She managed her own affairs. And soon, the whispers began to change their tune. She didn't grieve long. They'd murmur over a fence post. Seems that money dried her tears right up. It was then that Silas Blackwood entered the picture. Silas was a mine foreman, older than Zeo Zoe, a man with a bit of authority, and more importantly, a healthy savings account. He was a widower himself, known to enjoy his drink, a man whose loneliness was as plain to see as the coal dust on his boots. He saw in Zeo Zoe a beautiful, quiet woman, a fine wife to run his home and ease his later years. He was flattered by her attention. And Zeo Zoe, well, she saw something in him too. She saw security. She saw a bigger house, more money, another step up and away from the life she was born into. That first insurance policy had been a revelation. It had shown her a way out of the grime and the poverty, a path paved not with a lifetime of back-breaking labor, but with a simple signature on a piece of paper and a well-timed tragedy. Her courtship with Silas Blackwood wasn't a romance. It was a business transaction, and the whole community was watching. They saw the older man, charmed and foolish. They saw the young widow, her eyes not on the man, but on what the man had. The seeds of conflict weren't just being sown in that little house. They were being planted in the minds of every neighbor who watched her, every gossip at the company store. They were just waiting for a reason for their suspicions to take root, and Zeo Zoe was about to give them one. History isn't just found in archives. Sometimes it's sitting on a front porch in a rocking chair, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Down a winding road, I found Elmore Vance. He's an old man now, with hands as gnarled as oak roots and eyes that have seen nearly a century of these mountains. He is the great-nephew of Silas Blackwood, and his grandfather was the man who first tried to sound the alarm. For his family, the story of Zeo Zoe Wilkins isn't a folk tale. It's a wound that has never fully healed. He doesn't call her the Black Widow. In the Vance family, she has always been that Wilkins woman. He speaks in a slow, deliberate cadence, the way men do when they're recalling a story they've heard 1,000 times, a story that's become a part of their own blood. My granddaddy, Jasper, he begins, he liked Silas, but he never trusted her, not for a minute. He said she had still eyes, like a snake on a rock, watching but never blinking. According to the story passed down to Elmore, the trouble came to a head just 6 months after the wedding. Silas, puffed up with pride and eager to show what a good provider he was, told his brother Jasper that he'd taken out a brand new, sizable life insurance policy. "Just to make sure my Zeo is looked after if anything happens to me," he'd said with a grin. Elmore leans forward in his chair. Granddaddy said when he heard those words, a cold spot formed right in his gut. It was the same story, all over again. Jasper went to Silas that very evening and begged him to see reason. He didn't accuse Zeo Zoe directly, not at first. He just pleaded with his brother's common sense. "A woman who profits from one husband's grave is just unlucky," Elmore recounts his granddaddy saying. "But a woman who stands to profit from a second, that ain't luck, Silas. That's a plan." But Silas was blinded by his new bride. He got angry, accused his brother of jealousy, and told him to get out of his house and mind his own business. That argument, on the porch of a cabin that no longer stands, was more than just a family squabble. It was a line drawn in the dirt. Jasper Vance had made himself a problem. He had spoken the suspicion that everyone else was only whispering, and in doing so, he had put himself directly in the path of that Wilkins woman. The point of no return had been crossed, not just for Silas, but for his brother too. The argument didn't happen in whispers. It was a confrontation, born of desperation. Following his grim conversation with Silas, Jasper Vance couldn't let it rest. He walked over to his brother's cabin that very evening. The lamp was lit inside, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Zeo Zoe herself sat in a rocking chair by the hearth, darning one of Silas' work socks. She moved with a quiet efficiency, a picture of domestic peace. Jasper stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Silas," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk. That new insurance policy, it don't sit right with me." Silas, who had been enjoying the quiet evening, stiffened. He looked from his brother's worried face to his wife, who hadn't even looked up from her sewing. "Now, Jasper, we've been over this." "No, we ain't," Jasper insisted, stepping inside. "Earl Gibson took sick not long after she insured him. Now you do the same, and for twice the money. You're a fool if you don't see the pattern." The accusation hung in the small room, thick and ugly. Zeo Zoe's needle stopped its steady rhythm. For a single charged moment, the cabin was utterly silent. Silas's face flushed with anger. It was one thing for the town to whisper, but for his own brother to say it, in his own home, in front of his wife, it was an unbearable insult. "You'll not come into my house and call my wife a ghoul," he roared, getting to his feet. "She's a good woman. She's nursed me when I was sick. She's kept this house better than anyone. You're just jealous." "Jealous of what, Silas?" "Your own funeral?" Jasper shot back. "That was the final straw." "Get out," Silas snarled, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Get out of my home, and don't you come back till you're ready to apologize to her." Jasper looked at his brother, his face a mask of sorrow and frustration. Then, his eyes met Zeo Zoe's across the room. For the first time, she looked directly at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no fear. There was nothing at all. It was a calm, calculating stillness, the look of a woman who had just identified a problem and was already working on the solution. As Jasper backed out into the cold night air, he knew he hadn't just lost a brother. He had made a mortal enemy. The cabin door closed, shutting out not just a brother, but Silas Blackwood's last chance at salvation. You have to push your way through a thicket of rhododendron and climb over a fallen oak to find it now. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. But it's here. A collapsed square of foundation stones covered in a thick carpet of moss, and in the center, a jumbled pile of rock and soot-stained clay. This is all that's left of the chimney, once the warm, beating heart of the home where Silas Blackwood lived with his new wife. This isn't a place marked by the scars of a single violent act. There are no bullet holes in these stones. The horror that unfolded here was quiet, patient, and domestic. It was hidden in the everyday. Over there, nearly choked with a century of dead leaves, is the stone-lined well. This is where Zeo Zoe would have drawn the water for Silas' morning coffee, for the soup she simmered on the stove, for the cool drink he'd ask for when the first feverish thirst began to burn in his throat. Right here. This is where it happened. Not with the roar of a gunshot, but with the scrape of a spoon against the bottom of a bowl. The act of murder wasn't a moment of rage. It was a daily chore, a patient administering of poison disguised as an act of love. Within these stone foundations, Silas Blackwood wasted away, believing he was being cared for by a devoted wife, never realizing that the hands that soothed his brow were the same hands that were slowly, methodically killing him. The air is still and peaceful now, but this ground remembers the silence that followed the arguments and the terrible sickness that began soon after. It began, as Jasper Vance had feared, just a few weeks after their argument. Silas Blackwood started complaining of a fire in his belly. At first, he dismissed it as a bad batch of moonshine, a common ailment for him. Zeo Zoe was the very picture of a concerned wife. She brewed him herbal teas and insisted he stay home from the mines to rest. But the rest didn't help. The fire in his gut turned into a vice, twisting and cramping until the strong Foreman was doubled over in his chair. Then came the sickness, a violent, unending wave of it that left him weak and trembling. He craved water, a burning, desperate thirst that no amount of liquid could quench. And through it all, Zeo Zoe was a constant presence. She was always there with a cool cloth for his forehead and a bowl of thin broth. "Just a little something to keep your strength up," she would murmur, spooning the warm liquid into his mouth. To any neighbor who stopped by to check on the ailing man, she was a saint. They saw her tending to him day and night, her face etched with worry. They didn't see the tiny pinch of white powder she stirred into the soup when no one was looking. The days bled into weeks. Silas, once a stout and hearty man, began to shrink. His skin grew pale and loose, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets. He became a ghost in his own home, too weak to leave his bed. The company doctor came once, a rushed visit between a broken leg at the mine and a birthing up the creek. He took one look at the withered man in the bed, listened to Zeo Zoe's calm description of the symptoms, and nodded grimly. "It's the stomach flux, and a bad case of it," he declared. "Keep him comfortable. That's all you can do." One evening, after Silas had been bedridden for nearly a month, his brother Jasper came to the house again, swallowing his pride. He couldn't bear the thought of his brother dying without making peace. He found Silas barely conscious, his breathing shallow. Zeo Zoe sat by the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Jasper looked at the shell of his brother, then at her calm, serene face, and the awful truth settled in his heart like a stone. He left without a word, the image of that quiet, patient woman seared into his memory. The rocking chair in the corner of the room swayed gently in the draught from the door, empty, but for the shawl left draped over its back. Silas Blackwood's struggle ended 2 nights later, in the dark, silent heart of the Appalachian night. After a man dies, his story is told in whispers. But the version that lasts, the one that gets filed away, is told in ink. This is the death certificate for Silas Blackwood, filed in the county clerk's office. It's a simple bureaucratic ledger. Name, date of birth, date of death. And under the heading Cause of Death, the doctor wrote 2 words, acute gastritis. It's so clean, so medical. A neat and tidy explanation that fits perfectly in a little box on a form. But acute gastritis doesn't capture the truth of it. It doesn't describe a man wasting away for weeks, his body racked with a fire that no water could put out. It doesn't mention the insurance policy that had just been signed, or the brother who was shouting warnings that nobody listened to. The official record sanitizes the horror, boiling a slow, agonizing death down to a stomach ache. But then, you find another file. This one isn't from the doctor, it's from the insurance company. And insurance men, they have a different kind of curiosity. They deal in patterns and probabilities. The report, written by a claims investigator, is just as dry, but it asks a pointed question. He notes, "This is the second claim filed by Mrs. Wilkins in 3 years, both following the sudden gastric death of a husband. Further inquiry is recommended." Those 2 words, further inquiry, were the spark that lit the fuse. That recommendation led to this, the exhumation order from the circuit court judge. Look at the formal, looping script. It gives law enforcement the authority to go to the quiet churchyard cemetery and disturb a fresh grave. This piece of paper took the whispers of the holler and turned them into the cold, hard action of the law. The official record started with a lie, but it ended with an order to dig up the truth. That exhumation order was not a quiet affair. The news spread through the hollers like a brush fire. On the day the sheriff and his deputies arrived at the cemetery with shovels, a crowd gathered at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and dread. The sound of digging was the only noise that broke the silence. When the caskets of both Earl Gibson and Silas Blackwood were opened, a collective gasp went through the onlookers. The bodies were in an unnervingly well-preserved state, a telltale sign of the preserving qualities of arsenic. The whispers now had physical proof. The truth wasn't just buried 6 feet deep, it was pickled in poison. The day the law came for Zeo Zoe Wilkins, there was no dramatic chase through the mountains. Sheriff Miller and a deputy simply rode their horses up to her little house. She was on the porch, rocking in her chair, as if she were expecting them. They say she didn't flinch when the sheriff showed her the warrant for her arrest. She didn't cry or protest her innocence. She simply stood up, smoothed the front of her black dress, went inside to fetch her bonnet, and walked with them as calmly as if she were heading to the Sunday service. Her silence was more damning than any confession. The trial was a mountain spectacle. The courthouse was packed to the rafters every single day, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and cheap tobacco. Miners took days off from the coalface. Farmers left their fields, all to cram into the sweltering room and get a look at the woman they were now calling the Mountain Borgia. It wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. This was the community's chance to finally pass judgment on the woman who had unsettled them for so long. The prosecutor, a fire and brimstone preacher in a lawyer's suit, built his case brick by damning brick. He laid out the pattern of death and the pattern of profit, showing the jury how each untimely death had made Zeo Zoe a richer woman. His star witness was the town pharmacist, a nervous little man named Abernathy, who, under oath, pointed a trembling finger directly at the defendant. "That's her," he squeaked. "She's the one who kept buying rough-on-rats poison, said she had a terrible infestation, bought enough to kill every rat in the county." Her defense lawyer fought back, painting a picture of a poor, misunderstood widow being persecuted by superstitious neighbors. He argued that dysentery was common, that arsenic was used in every farmhouse, that this was nothing more than a witch hunt fueled by gossip and jealousy. But his arguments were undone by his own client. Zeo Zoe sat through the entire proceeding as still as a stone effigy. When the prosecutor finally turned to her and thundered, "Did you feed these men poison for their insurance money, Mrs. Wilkins?" She looked at him with those unblinking eyes and said, in a voice no louder than a rustling leaf, "No, sir, I did not." She showed no fear, no anger, no grief, nothing. That chilling calm was all the jury needed to see. They were out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were set like stone. The foreman didn't even look at her as he delivered the verdict. Guilty. The judge, his voice ringing with condemnation, called her actions a cold-blooded stain upon the soul of this state and sentenced her to spend the rest of her natural life in the state penitentiary. The law's pursuit was over. The official record was now written, and Zeo Zoe Wilkins's name was forever etched into the annals of Appalachian crime. We're back where we started, in this quiet little cemetery tucked into the side of the mountain. Here are the stones for Earl Gibson and Silas Blackwood. They're weathered, but you can see that someone still tends to them. The weeds are pulled back, and a small faded plastic flower sits in the dirt in front of Silas's marker. Their names are still here, etched in stone, a permanent testament to the lives they lived, however short. They remain a part of this land, buried in the soil they called home, remembered by family. But to find Zeo Zoe Wilkins's final resting place, you have to travel hundreds of miles away, to the grounds of the old state penitentiary. There's a field there, behind the high stone walls. It's not a family plot. It's a place of grim uniformity, a grid of simple, numbered markers for the inmates who lived and died in the state's care. There are no loving epitaphs, no flowers, no family names. It's a place scrubbed clean of personal history. And under one of those anonymous markers lies the woman who caused so much turmoil. There is the final biting irony of her story. The woman who craved land, money, and independence, who killed to possess the property of other men, ended her days with nothing to her name. Her final home is a numbered plot of earth owned by the very state that locked her away. Her victims, the poor miners she looked down on, lie here in the free mountain air, their names known. Her name, the one that once struck fear into a whole community, is nowhere to be found. Looking at these disparate graves, the remembered and the forgotten, you realize the verdict wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the final chapter. For the families left behind, and for Zeo Zoe herself, the sentence was the start of a long, slow aftermath, a shadow that would stretch on for decades. After the gavel fell and the cell door clanged shut, a different kind of quiet settled over the holler. The excitement of the trial bled away, leaving behind the awkward silence of a community that had just consumed one of its own. For a time, life tried to return to normal. The company whistle blew, the men went back into the mines, and the women went back to their chores. But a scar had been left. Doors were locked a little tighter at night, and a neighbor's sudden sickness was met with a flicker of suspicion that hadn't been there before. For Jasper Vance, the verdict was not a victory. The justice he had fought so hard for tasted like ash in his mouth. It didn't bring his brother back. It didn't erase the memory of Silas wasting away in that bed, or the image of Zeo Zoe's cold, placid face in the courtroom. He had been right, but being right had brought him no peace. He lived out his years a quieter, more somber man, forever marked by the knowledge of what one human being was capable of doing to another, hidden behind a placid smile and a bowl of soup. Meanwhile, Zeo Zoe Wilkins traded the green, open mountains for a world of grey stone and iron bars. Her reputation preceded her, and the other inmates at the penitentiary gave her a wide berth. They watched the infamous Black Widow, expecting to see a monster. Instead, they saw a quiet, reserved woman who did her work in the prison laundry without complaint, who read books from the meager library, and who never, ever spoke of her past. Her chilling composure, which had condemned her in court, now served as a kind of armor. She was an enigma within the walls, just as she had been in the hollow. The years ground on, turning the ink on the court records from black to brown. Zeo Zoe's dark hair turned to grey. Her youth and beauty faded under the harsh prison lights, but her story didn't. She never filed an appeal. She never sought a pardon. And to the parole boards that met with her every few years, she gave the same calm, unwavering answer she gave in the courtroom. I did not do it. Her silence became her final legacy, a wall of denial that would stand until the day she died, an old woman in a prison infirmary, taking her secrets, whatever they were, with her to a numbered grave. You'd think a guilty verdict and a life sentence would be the end of it. The case closed, the story finished. But in the mountains, stories have a way of living on, of changing shape in the telling. And the story of Zeo Zoe Wilkins is no exception. To this day, the truth of what happened in that little cabin remains a point of contention, a ghost that haunts the family lines. For the descendants of the Vance family, and for most people who know the tale, the book is closed. Zeo Zoe Wilkins was a monster hiding in plain sight, A mountain Medea who saw her husbands not as partners, but as assets to be liquidated. They point to the pattern, the insurance money, the pharmacist's testimony, and her chilling lack of emotion in the courtroom. To them, it's an open and shut case, a clear story of greed dressed in a black mourning gown. But Zeo Zoe never confessed. And that single stubborn fact, her lifelong insistence on her own innocence, has been just enough to keep a flicker of doubt alive for 100 years. You can still find a few old-timers, a few contrarians, who will offer up the other side. They'll ask you, was she a killer? Or was she just a woman who refused to play the part of the helpless, weeping widow? In an age when women were expected to be emotional and dependent, Zeo Zoe was quiet, intelligent, and handled her own finances. Was she condemned for murder, or was she condemned for being different? They'll point out that the evidence was purely circumstantial. No one ever saw her put poison in the soup. They saw a woman buy rat poison, a common household item, and they saw men die of a common stomach ailment, and they drew a straight, deadly line between the two. Perhaps, they argue, she was just the victim of a mountain witch hunt, a woman destroyed by gossip and the bad luck of being widowed twice. The truth? The absolute truth of what was in her heart probably died with her in that prison infirmary. All we're left with are the conflicting echoes, two stories that can't both be true, but that both refuse to die. Over the decades, the hard facts of the Zeo Zoe Wilkins trial began to soften and warp, like old glass in a fire. Her story leached out of the courthouse records and seeped into the soil of the mountains themselves, where it grew into something else entirely, a full-blown Appalachian legend. The flesh-and-blood woman who bought rat poison at the general store was slowly replaced by a supernatural phantom, a creature of folklore. For generations, her name became a cautionary tale. Mothers would warn their sons, "You be careful of a pretty face with a quiet tongue." Remember Zeo Zoe? She became the local boogeyman, a dark fable about the poison of greed. They stopped talking about arsenic and started whispering about a secret spring deep in the woods whose water was tainted by the devil himself, water she would collect in a blue glass bottle under a new moon. They swore that the roses she planted on her husband's graves always bloomed with withered black petals, as if the very ground rejected her feigned grief. And of course, there is the ghost story. Some say that on a moonless night, if you stand by the fallen chimney where her house once stood, you can sometimes see a faint light moving through the trees. They say it's the ghost of Zeo Zoe, forever wandering the land she bought with blood, eternally searching for something she can never truly own. The real woman died in a state prison far from here. But the legend, the dark and terrifying story the mountains created to explain a horror they couldn't comprehend, that story never left. And so we find ourselves back where we began, standing in this quiet patch of ground among the leaning stones. It looks the same. The ivy still crawls over the fence line, and the wind still sighs through the pines. But it feels different now, doesn't it? These aren't just names on weathered rock anymore. They are Earl and Silas, men with hopes and fears, whose lives ended in a bowl of soup. We see the ghost of a small cabin over on that ridge, and we can almost feel the cold, calculating gaze of the woman who watched the world from its porch. We have followed this story from these graves to the dusty pages of the courthouse, from the faded memory of an old man on his porch to the grim reality of a prison ledger. We've seen how a real-life tragedy, born of desperation and greed, can curdle into a ghost story told to frighten children. It's a reminder that every forgotten foundation, every overgrown family plot you pass on a lonely road isn't just a ruin. It's a library, filled with stories of love, rage, and the terrible choices that can echo for a century. Was Zeo Zoe Wilkins a cold-blooded monster or a misunderstood woman condemned by circumstance? The absolute truth of what was in her heart is likely buried with her in that anonymous grave. But in the end, it almost doesn't matter. The story she created, whether by her actions or by her silence, has become a part of this landscape, as permanent as the mountains themselves. The arsenic has long since turned to dust. The insurance money is gone. The people are all just memories, but the story remains.